So Paul, it is straight up 5 o'clock. So should we go ahead and get started?
I think we might as well. We have a lot to cover, so we might as well just get into it.
We do. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share here so that we just have the two of us on the side-by-side mode. So my name is Kate Johans. I'm the Marketing and Communications Director at ATPE. With me is Paul Tapp, ATPE Managing Attorney.
Welcome, everyone. Like Kate said, my name is Paul Tapp, Managing Attorney. Going to talk to you a little bit this afternoon about what's going on now with COVID. We did a couple of these webinars back in August during the summer and covered a lot of ground at that point. We got together and kind of realized, it's been a few months since we did those webinars, covered the issues that were new then, realized, those aren't new anymore, but we have some new ones that have come up since then. Everyone's lived through this and knows how the whole environment has evolved over the last 4 months. We realized there were some issues from vaccinations to teachers who were out from being able to work from home, who were being told that they need to come back to work at this point, some things that just weren't issues when we did our last webinar. So we wanted to cover those this afternoon.
Yes, absolutely. We have quite a long list of questions, and just as a matter of housekeeping before we get started, we do have the Q&A open. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. I will say that we did receive quite a few questions from y'all through the registration process. So we are going to answer those first. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. And we always are adding content to the COVID-19 FAQs page at atpe.org/coronavirus. So with that in mind, we will get started with the questions. So as Paul, as you just mentioned, we now have been through, we're going on the third semester of this, and the situation has evolved quite a bit. And I guess that's one question I would have kind of at a broader level. How have you seen ATPE members' concerns evolve since last March?
Well, and everyone, the entire environment has evolved for teachers. I mean, it's for everybody, but certainly for teachers. One of the biggest changes we've seen over the months is districts who started out either fully remote or almost fully remote with their instruction, and a large percent of the teachers being able to work from home. And over the months, as students came back to the campus following the guidelines that TEA had put out about in-person instruction and allowing students to return to the campus that wanted to, that has led to educators, teachers being asked to return to the campus as well. That's one of the biggest changes we've seen. And then, of course, just as the coronavirus has evolved, and most importantly, as everybody knows, we have vaccine now. And so we have a lot of questions about vaccines, from two different angles. And we're going to talk about both. When are teachers going to get vaccinated, and do teachers have to get vaccinated?
Well, let's just dive into that, because I can't have a conversation these days with anyone that doesn't turn to vaccines. So I think the number one question on all of our minds right now, are educators going to be prioritized to get the vaccine?
We do not know at this point, and I'm going to say it right here at the beginning, and I'm going to repeat this several times over the course of this webinar. What I am going to tell you is accurate as of today, January 28th, 2021. Things evolve. This webinar, and to those of you who are not watching this on January 28th, I'm teleportating myself into the future here. Those of you who may be watching this later in February or March or however long we leave this up, you're going to need to check and make sure that no changes have been made. Now, when anything substantial happens, we'll take this down, but in the meantime, just make sure that nothing's changed in the meantime, because this is evolving. I mean, this is evolving sometimes very quickly, so things can change very quickly. But what I'm going to tell you is basically what is going on right now. And going back to the question at hand about teachers being prioritized, there is the guidance that we have at this point has stated that there are no particular jobs that are being prioritized as far as getting the vaccine, other than what we've seen from the very first group about healthcare workers. Some of you may have seen or may know of school nurses who have been able to get the vaccine because they are considered healthcare workers. But teachers are not. And so at this point, in both the Texas Department of Human Services and TEA have both stated that at this point, there isn't a plan to have teachers as a group in any of the particular groups as far as prioritization. This may change though. We've seen changes in the priorities already. At this point, there are only two groups that have been set up by the state of Texas, 1A and 1B. 1A, of course, was healthcare workers and residents of long care nursing homes, long care facilities. 1B was individuals over 65 and individuals with an underlying health condition. Now, teachers, of course, who fit those categories under 1B are eligible for the vaccine now, but it goes to being eligible under either being because of age or because of underlying health condition. Those are the only groups that have been set up at this point. If you go to the state website, you will see that there are some blanks there for whether it's 1C, whether it's 2, whether it's 2A, whatever it is that the state is going to do hasn't been done. So it is possible that sometime in the future, there will be some kind of priority given to particular jobs, particular careers like teaching. But it has not happened at this point. At this point, we are all just together and it just comes down at this point to age and health condition.
And so that is on the Department of State Health Services website, the DISH's website, and we do have a link to that on the the ATPE COVID-19 FAQs page.
And I'll just say real quickly, that is a great place for up-to-date information. Like I said, things can change, and we will be updating the ATPE FAQs as far as issues relating to educators as quickly as we can. But if you just want the latest in COVID information and what Texas is doing about vaccines, about COVID, that is the best place to go. They have FAQs there as well. And that's where I get a lot of my information from.
So with the healthcare worker, would someone, like we just had a question come in, would an occupational therapist or a physical therapist working in an educational environment be considered a healthcare worker like a nurse?
At this point, no. But again, it may change.
Okay, that's good to know. So, and this is probably a free-for-all question, but how can you go about getting a vaccine? Like, how do you get started?
And yes, and this is something that's very definitely going to be subject to change because this has changed dramatically just in the last couple of weeks. Basically the vaccines, it depends on number one, being able to have access to it. The way it basically works is the CDC determines how much vaccine each individual state is going to receive. From there, it's up to the state to determine who it is that's going to get the vaccine and how the vaccine is going to be distributed. The state distribution system was recently changed. If you've been keeping up, you've probably seen to a hub system. Rather than sending the vaccines out to just the myriad Walgreens and CVS and hospitals and doctors' clinics and stuff, they decided what they were going to do is they were going to focus on individual hubs in different areas. Now, the Department of Health Services website does still say that their idea is that they are still going to, when they can, provide vaccines outside of these hubs. But it seems like they are very much focusing on these hubs at this point. Anyone who has tried to get a vaccine has probably been told, well, what you need to do is you need to contact the state so that you can make an appointment at one of these hubs. And it is possible, again, on that same website that we've been talking about, it has information about how to make such an appointment. So that is basically the way of going about it at this point. Now, again, the only people that they are considering giving the vaccine to are groups in either 1A or 1B. So either healthcare workers or a person who's 65 or over, or someone who has an underlying health condition. There is a list of health conditions that they consider to put you at risk for COVID. So someone who has one on that risk. It's not an exclusive list, but obviously it's a significant one.
So kind of flipping the question a little bit, we've talked a lot about if you want to get a vaccine, how you do that. Turning the question on its head, can your district make you get the vaccine?
This is a little complicated. This is the kind of question that a lawyer would love, but probably nobody else would, because it's a multi-part question, or a multi-part answer, sorry. The answer as of right now is that no one can be required to take the vaccine. The reason that is the answer now is because the vaccine that is available now has not actually gone through the full FDA approval process. It is actually being distributed under an emergency authorization. And as long as it is being distributed under an emergency authorization, no one can be required to take it. Now, at some point in the future, though, it is likely going to receive the full FDA approval. And at that point, the general rule, and this doesn't have anything to do with coronavirus, this has just been the rule for a long time. The general rule is that an employer, if the employer has legitimate business reason for doing so, can require an employee to be vaccinated. That is just the general rule. It is probable that, again, because of all the concerns that we all know about with difficulty in social distancing, that a school district as an employer would be able to say that, yes, we do have that legitimate business interest. So under this sort of generally understood rule, once again, not now, but once the vaccine gets the full FDA approval, an employer, including the school district, would be able to require it. Now, there's a big caveat to that, because this is a general rule. It has nothing to do with COVID. And if any entity, whether it was the federal government, whether it was the state government, said you cannot require this, then that's going to govern. Again, the fact that we have this general rule that says an employer can require it doesn't mean that the governor can't come in, legislature can't come in. Some entity that has the authority to make a specific rule can't come in and say, well, that may be the general rule, but it's not the rule in this case. So just kind of recap, because I know I just covered a lot of ground there. As of now, cannot be required to take the vaccine. At some point in the future, once it's received authorization, it's possible that you may be able to be required to take the vaccine, but it may be, because of some sort of governmental action, not be required to take the vaccine.
So on a related note, if our coworkers aren't required to take the vaccine, could an educator be required to work around someone who hasn't been vaccinated?
The general answer for that's yes. Just like, obviously, educators know, hardly anyone's had the vaccine yet, and a lot of y'all have been required to work around your coworkers, even though they haven't been vaccinated. Now, the caveat to that is that we'll get into the accommodations under the ADA in just a minute, but the caveat to that is that it is possible as an accommodation under the ADA to, just like the accommodations for working from home over the fall and what we're going to be talking about continuing that into the spring, it could be an accommodation of the ADA to not work around someone who has been vaccinated. But that's how it would work. But the general rule is yes, there is no, I can't be required to work around someone unless they have been vaccinated.
Okay, well, that's kind of a good transition. We did receive quite a few questions about work from home accommodations, and I know that's something that many of our members have had questions about, particularly it seemed like after the winter break, a lot of the districts, I know in Austin ISD, there was a lot of publicity about work from home accommodations that had been granted in the fall being denied for the spring semester. Is it legal for the district to do that? Why is this happening now?
Okay. And I will say this is a very complicated area of the law, but I'll try to break it down in a way that, and I think it is possible to break it down in a way that actually kind of makes it understandable. When what we are talking about in most cases is an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this goes to basically the kind of evolution in teaching that we were talking about at the very beginning about how when school started back in August, September for everyone, a lot of districts were more or less completely remote. They did all of their instruction remote. All of the students, or almost all of the students, were learning from home. What that did was it eliminated something that was common in teaching for forever, really, when it comes down to it. And that is the requirement that teachers be there just to physically monitor their students in the classroom, that they be the adult in the room. So basically at that point, because there weren't any kids in the room, it meant that it wasn't absolutely necessary for a teacher to be in the room. Now, why is this important? This is important because under the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, a person with a disability, and I will say, we could talk about this for a long time, but I will just say that if a person who is at risk because of a health condition that puts them more at risk for COVID is generally understood to have a disability, so the ADA applies to them. A person with a disability can ask for an accommodation, and obvious accommodation for someone who shouldn't be around people because they're at risk of getting sick is to not be around people, working at home. Now, in order for an employer like a school district to be required to provide an accommodation, that accommodation has to be quote unquote reasonable. And to be reasonable, one of the most important things is that the person has to be able to do all of the term is essential functions of the job. In other words, you have to be able to do the job. The ADA doesn't require a school district or any employer to take away something that's really, that's the reason you actually have the job. When it comes down to it, for a teacher, teaching. But teaching, actually providing instruction is not necessarily the only thing that is essential to teaching. But it comes down to what is essential to teaching. Well, like I said before, one of the things that in most cases is essential to teaching is being that adult in the room, being the person that's there that is making sure the kids are behaving themselves, sitting in their room, sitting in their desks, actually learning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's generally, in most cases, part of the requirement of being a teacher. Unless, of course, there aren't any kids in the room because all the kids are back at home. So what that meant was because all the kids were back at home, it raised a serious question as to, well, is being at school an essential function for a teacher anymore? And a lot of districts accepted the fact that it's not. And because that was no longer essential function, and because teachers could provide all the instruction from home, it was considered a reasonable accommodation to allow the teachers to teach from home as well. So that was a circumstance for quite a while, for weeks, for months, some places, and actually some districts actually still continuing on until now. But what we saw again, and what all of you all know from working in public education, is over the course of the fall and continuing on into the spring, more and more students are returning to in-person instruction in the classroom. So what that means is, again, you're in a situation where, okay, before there wasn't this requirement for a teacher to be in the classroom with the students because there were no students there. Now you've got some students who are coming back, and there is getting to be a requirement to have that adult in the room. And so school districts are in a position of being able to say that, okay, it was a reasonable accommodation before because we didn't need you in the room actually supervising the students that were there, but the students are back now, and we do need you in the room supervising them. That is now an essential function of your job. Now, one of the things that we've seen, and one of the problems that we have had with some school districts, is the ADA requires that these decisions be made individually. And that's a very important part of the ADA, that the school district as an employer has to look at each individual person and that individual person's actual situation, the facts. I mean, the ADA is complicated, but it is a very practical law. It's very important as to what it is that is really going on. What is your situation? Not sort of theoretical, not possibility. We're talking black and white here. We're talking facts here. So one of the things that we saw is a lot of districts basically say, well, you know, being in the classroom is essential to teaching, so we can't, you know, we're just going to call everybody back. Well, again, there's a good argument if their kids there. If, again, they have students that really do need supervision, they actually do have a good argument that, okay, what used to be a reasonable accommodation from working at home is no longer a reasonable accommodation, because it used to be we didn't need you supervising the students. That's changed now. Now we do need you supervising the students, so we need you back at the campus. If they can actually show that that's the case, then they have a good argument. But we've seen some districts who, again, just have this idea, are doing it more on the theoretical level, which is what I said you're not supposed to do, which is, oh, teachers just should be in the classroom. That's not how the ADA works.
So it seems like one of the questions that we've received through the chat today was, you know, who are the teachers who are able to work from home? So it doesn't seem like there's any way you could say like, well, generally people with this condition are able to work from home. It seems like it's going to be really dependent on the district situation plus your personal situation.
It does. It is completely, and again, one of the most important things about the ADA is that it be individual. And so it depends a lot on what can happen. And one of the analogies I use a lot, because it's really common, we all have job descriptions. I have a job description, Kate has a job description, everybody has a job description. And one of the things that are always on the job description at the end is something like you are able to lift 20 pounds. And I will say, you know, I fortunately can lift 20 pounds. I can do my job without being able to lift 20 pounds. It's on my job description. It is not an essential function of my job of being a lawyer for ATPE. There are things that aren't teacher job descriptions. An example I can give though for teachers is, again, maybe something about lifting. If you're a math teacher, probably not an essential function of your job. If you're a life skills teacher and you have students that you need to be able to lift in and out of wheelchairs and be able to put up on tables and stuff because they're not that mobile, that actually may be essential function of your job. So this particular thing, being able to lift a certain amount of weight for a teacher, it could be essential function in one situation, not an essential function in another situation. And that's just an example. So there are some, but again, probably the one that's the most important is, can the district really say they need you there at the campus because of the students who are going to be there? Now, again, I've used the example of supervising students because I think that's probably the biggest example that's going on. There can be other reasons that what was an essential function or what was a reasonable accommodation is not anymore. I think that's by far the most important one, though, is just the students returning to the classroom.
So kind of related, one of the questions that's just come in is about educators who are caregivers to people who have, you've got a spouse or a parent or a child in your home who has a compromised immune system. Are there any legal protections to ask for a change in assignment? For instance, this question says, is there any legal ground to request moving from special ed to gen ed to try to be in a room with higher mask compliance? Is that even a thing?
And I've got to distinguish here between legal ground and just possible to do. It's certainly possible to do. There is no legal basis for it because the legal basis for requesting accommodation is what we're talking about here under the ADA, requires that it be the employee that has the disability. It does not apply to an issue and it may be completely legitimate issue. And one of the things we've dealt with a lot with COVID are family members who are at high risk, completely legitimate concern. Unfortunately, the ADA does not apply to having a family member who has the disability and that needs the accommodation. It has to be the employees, the educator's disability. So completely legitimate request, and certainly can ask, district can certainly accommodate it, but there isn't a law we can point to that says the district has any obligation to accommodate that the way there is with a personal disability like your own health condition.
Okay. Well, one thing, and I'll just distill, we've gotten quite a few questions that are relevant to specific situations. And obviously within this format, we can't offer individual legal advice. But I do remind you, if you are an eligible ATPE member, you can always call the state office during business hours or submit a ticket, or not a ticket, a member legal services intake system request for individual assistance. But generally, we have several people who've written in that said, I had an accommodation. Now they've called teachers back. I've got a generic letter. What options do I have? Kind of generally, what options does someone have?
And the first option is, again, we don't know. We don't think districts have done this right in a lot of cases. So the fact that you've been called back doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have any options under the ADA for an accommodation. So that's the first option, is to actually look at the situation, talk to the district, find out why is it that you're saying that I have to come back? Is there that legitimate factual reason? This is why. It's not just that we think it's a good idea, but we really need you. Here is why it is that we need you. Other than that, I will say the options are not great. I wish I could tell you otherwise, but they are not great. There is possibly some leave options for you, depending on the individual circumstances. That could be something. Now, the leave options are not what they once were, because the two COVID-specific types of leave that we had beginning last spring through the summer and fall, unfortunately disappeared on December 31st because they expired and have not yet been reinstituted. Now, I have heard that there is at least talk in Washington, D.C. of recreating those types of leave that actually gives you some type of paid leave if you are ill or a family member is ill, or some type of paid leave if you have to be out because your school's closed and has had to go remote and you have to be at home because your child is at home. Those are the two types of leave that we lost. So they may be coming back, but at this point they're not there. Now, we know there are some districts that locally have adopted some type of COVID-specific leave. We know of a few, don't know, we just have heard of them anecdotally so far. We don't know how common that is, but we know that there have been some that have. But there are some leave options. Again, that's not great because nobody wants to have to use your leave in this kind of situation, but there is that. Fortunately, the only other real option is basically saying I can't come back. Teachers, of course, have a contract, and that does make leaving a little more complicated than most people. But with a legitimate reason, a legitimate health reason, which families members, close family members, health issues can be considered a legitimate reason to have good cause to leave the district before the end of the school year. Again, not a great option, I understand, but it is an option that's there.
And so do you think there might be, I mean, we certainly have had a change at the federal level in new administration beginning. Do you think that that might result in them taking another look? It was the Families First Coronavirus Relief
That's
Act,
that.
right? Yeah. Okay.
We hope.
Response, not really.
Yeah. We honestly hope. Too early to tell. I've actually asked whether, anybody know whether they're talking about just extending the leave so that, okay, if you used it in the fall, well, I'm sorry, you still used the leave, but if you managed to get through the fall without having to use it, you still got it, or whether it's going to be some additional leave. Honestly, it's too early to tell about that. The change in administration is, without getting into politics, is for these kinds of issues probably a positive, probably more likely to come from the changes that have happened both in the administration and honestly in Congress as well. But don't know. They did not put it into the package that passed before the end of the year. Don't know how much has changed since then. Again, there's talk of it, but don't know how far it's going to go.
Okay. Well, seems like we could spend a whole hour talking about accommodations, but we should probably address some of the other questions. One thing that's really come up quite a bit is safety protocols, the number of students in a classroom. Who even determines what quarantine policies or safety districts a district must follow?
That is a complicated issue. Probably the clearest, the entity that has the most authority on that at this point and has done the most on that at this point is TEA. TEA has established guidance. It's available on it's available both on TEA website and on the ATPE website. Has established guidance as to protocols that districts are supposed to use. The governor has, in one of the governor's orders, basically referenced that guidance. It's basically said that districts should follow that guidance. We had some questions early on as to really how enforceable TEA's guidance was, because there's a question as to whether TEA had the legal authority to actually order school districts to take any particular action in this kind of area. We do think that the governor, having added to one of his orders that districts should follow TEA guidance, actually does give it more legal weight than it might have had if it was just TEA giving guidance. But that is probably, as far as requirements for a school district, that is where we have the most. CDC has put out guidance as to best practices, but as far as requirements go, what's come from the CDC really is just that. It is just guidance. It says what you should do, but it does not say anything about what anyone has to do. It basically, again, like I said, it just says what you should do. Now, and I will say, and I'll just put it out here right at the very beginning, one of the issues that we've had is, okay, we've got the guidance there that says school districts need to do X, Y, and Z, should do X, Y, and Z, must do X, Y, and Z. Before, actually this afternoon, before this webinar, I decided, I'm going to look and see if I can find a news report of anyone ever getting any kind of fine, any kind of negative action for not wearing a mask in the state of Texas. I'm just going to do a Google search and see if I can find a news report of that. I didn't. Honestly, I found report after report after report of city councils basically voting down municipal ordinances that would have required masks, things like that. There is an enforcement issue. There is a serious enforcement issue. Anyone who's been following this has probably seen the governor multiple times as he's been asked to, create stronger prohibitions on things. Basically said, look, local entities aren't enforcing the prohibitions that they have here. And honestly, they're not. So we've got a problem. Because we have this guidance from TEA. And like I said at the beginning, because the governor has given it legal weight, it goes beyond guidance. It is at the level of requirement at this point. But we have seen at every level substantial pushback or just failure to have any consequences to people who are not following guidance. And I will say, and I think we're going to talk about this probably a little bit in just a minute, we have had situations where individual teachers have actually received documentation, have received reprimands because the COVID officer, which I thought was an interesting term, a COVID officer has seen that there were kids in their room that didn't have their masks properly on their face. So it happens in some places, but there are a lot of places it's not.
So that was actually going to be a question. So can teachers get in trouble for their students' refusal to comply?
And yeah, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But as far as the protocols go, it comes down, and this is one of the things that we've seen is it comes down a lot to the community. Unfortunately, COVID, and particularly precautions with COVID, were politicized very early. And again, I don't want to get into politics here, but it's a fact. It's just a fact that happened. And rather than people seeing it completely as a health issue, they are seeing it as some weird quasi-health political issue. And that masks are obviously the big issue. I constitutional right not to wear a mask. I'm not sure where that comes from, but I'm sure we've all heard it. So it's difficult to know what to do. And it's difficult for me to provide any sort of general guidance or advice as to what to do if you happen to be in a place that is not following the protocols that are there, because the individual situations can vary so much. And a lot of time, and the reason can vary so much. Again, sometimes it comes down to community. We had one community where the superintendent of the district said they weren't even going to report the COVID cases, even though there is an absolute black and white legal requirement that they report COVID cases. It's a perfect example of there not being any consequences to anything, because there was a back and forth between the local district attorney and TEA as to who it is. Again, we're talking about someone who was blatantly saying they weren't going to follow the law. And there was a back and forth between the two entities saying, well, who's going to do something about this? Both of them said, well, you should do it. And neither did. So individual educators are dealing with this themselves in a lot of different cases. In terms of dealing with it, again, a lot comes to community. Sometimes it's an issue of, administrators just not wanting to be the bad guy, not wanting to be the person that tells the teacher, look, you've got to wear the mask. Sometimes they don't see it as necessarily that serious, and they haven't heard any complaints, so they just don't want to deal with it. Sometimes they have their own feelings about it. Very individual circumstances. So I can't tell you any good, this is what you do if you deal with that, if you have that situation. There are options though. And like Kate said before, eligible ATPE members can certainly contact us and kind of talk through the options related to their own individual situations. So going back to the issue that Kate had brought up about the teachers getting reprimands for their students. We'll just use an example because that's what we've seen so far. Their students not wearing a mask properly. Can a teacher be reprimanded for that? The general answer is teacher can be reprimanded for anything. Reprimanded. You can get documented for almost anything. I've been doing this for about a little over 24 years now, and I've had given this explanation to educators quite a few times over those years. There is a big difference between documentation and anything else. There are no requirements as far as the documentation goes. A supervisor can create documentation in any kind of situation. That is very different, though, from the district being able to do anything with it. Now, one of the reasons documentation is such a big issue with educators is, of course, because you have contracts. And that means that it's just, everything from appraisals, evaluations, and anything else gets documented more because you have due process rights. District is in a position of potentially having to show that they have some good reason to take action if for some reason they're thinking of actually taking any action against you. The important thing for educators to understand is that if it ever gets to that point, the fact that there's some document that said X, Y, or Z happened doesn't prove that it did and doesn't prove that you did anything wrong. Now, generally speaking, a teacher is going to want to respond, give their side of the story if they get some kind of documentation about that. But district is still going to have to show that whatever it is that the teacher did, there was something wrong with it. And yes, we understand that not all students are the same. It is not the same asking a fourth grader to keep their mask up the way it is asking a senior in high school to keep their mask up. And, realistically, teachers can't be, those teachers are in different circumstances. And yes, as far as anything actually happening, that would be something that the teacher could use. And that's something the teacher can use as far as a response. So the black and white answer is yes, teachers can receive documentation for that kinds of things simply because they can receive documentation, whether it's legitimate or not, on anything, about anything work related. But teachers do have a chance to respond to it so that their record actually shows what it is that really happened.
So a couple of minutes ago, you brought up districts not reporting COVID cases. And I feel like that's something we're hearing a lot from ATPE members, that they don't feel like the district dashboard or the campus dashboard reflects what they know or see happening amongst students or their colleagues. Why is this happening? Why are educators seeing cases that they don't think are being reported?
I think there's a myriad reasons for that. And we do hear this issue a lot. And like I said, I think there are a lot of different reasons for it, depending on the circumstances. I think number one, there are situations where they're just, whether it's an individual campus administrator or district administrator, they just don't want to cooperate. Again, we have a black and white open example of that. That does happen. There are other situations where there isn't anyone, it's not like they've decided they're not going to do it, but one of the things about the whole reporting requirement, much like the vaccines, there's a lot of moving parts to getting a report from point A to point B. And it requires a lot of people to do something in order and to keep that information moving from point A to point B. And sometimes that works better than others. There are some districts that are just more bureaucratic than others. There are some that are more efficient than others. So there are times, and we've seen this a lot, where the database is just behind, and it sometimes is behind a week or two, just because, again, they just aren't getting the information from the campuses to the database that quickly. It's not that anyone's really trying to hide anything. It is just that it just isn't working that fast. There are other situations too where there is potentially some misunderstanding about what the circumstances are, about what it is that's being reported. Was there a real case? Did we actually, or is it really for sure? Is it secondhand information that, oh, I heard that another, that so-and-so had COVID, and turns out that, well, no, actually they didn't. And so it didn't get reported because they never did, even though, yes, by this point, everyone's heard it because it's a good story. That happens honestly as well. So it is the whole range. There are situations where there are things that should get reported that aren't. But again, the dashboards are a tool, but they're not a perfect tool. It's not something I would tell anyone that they should really rely on as far as accurate information.
Okay, that's good to know. I think it is frustrating because I think, that is one of the few tangible things we can hold on to right now when everything is still so very uncertain, are those numbers. I know I've gotten hooked on the data. So what rights, this was kind of an interesting question we got from one member. The district provides rapid level testing on the campus, but the student's parents refuse for the student to be tested. Can an educator refuse to be around a student who doesn't follow the protocols?
As far as testing goes, TEA has been very clear. If you are using the TEA provided rapid test, the district cannot require a student to take it. And TEA has been very, very black and white about that. And there's no circumstance. They've been very clear that if you got a student athlete, you cannot make it a requirement of participating in the sport. Even though, that's not anything that's particularly required. Theoretically, you could say, look, if you want to play football, basketball, volleyball, soccer, you got to do it. But yeah, TA has been clear that if you're using their provided tests, district cannot require a student to do it. Student under 18 has to actually have a permission slip in order to get tested. 18 or above doesn't have to have a permission slip, but below that is supposed to have a permission slip. So number one, cannot generally speaking require the testing. As far as working around students, the teacher can't say, well, the student has refused to be tested, so I'm not going to work around them. But one thing to remember is the TEA guidance does require a school district to isolate students who are experiencing COVID symptoms, and not just confirmed case of COVID. It is COVID symptoms. And again, this is the TEA guidance, but like I said before, that does arguably have the weight of law because of Governor Abbott. District is required to isolate them until their parents are able to come pick them up. So for a student who is actually exhibiting COVID symptoms, a teacher should not be having to work around them. We have had some issues. Again, they're supposed to be isolated. It does raise the question of, okay, isolated where and how? I myself talked to a teacher back a couple of months ago, I think at this point, maybe more like a month, that her assignment was she was supposed to monitor the kids who were isolated because they had COVID symptoms. Somebody's
assignment.
Right? Yeah, I know. Somebody's going to do it. They provided, I will say, school district provided additional PPE. They actually did have some decent protocols in place for that. But there is going to be some staff member who may be doing that. But rank and file teacher, if student is exhibiting symptoms, you should not have to be around that student.
Okay. We're getting some really good questions in. I think we're definitely going to be adding some things to the FAQs. I think one question, certainly something that was making news yesterday with the State Board of Education meeting. I know we reported on that on our Teach the Vote blog about Commissioner Morath stating that he did not intend to ask for a federal waiver of testing, that the STAR would still take place. Why is the state still expecting us to administer STAR this year when our students are struggling so much?
That is a good question. And I really understand there's good arguments about why are we doing this. Now, one thing that Morath has made very clear is they are not going to use the testing for any accountability purposes, which of course that was the thing that was most of a concern to us, because clearly it would not be appropriate to use for accountability purposes. This has not been a normal year, and neither teachers, school districts, campuses should be held to the standards, the normal accountability standards because of that. Morath has made clear it's not going to be used for that. His justification for doing it is that it would be a good measure of where the students are. You know, there's been a lot of talk about learning loss because of remote learning, and how, you know, a lot of it comes down to how you feel about testing and whether you think testing is actually a good, accurate measure of learning. Something we can do a whole nother seminar on, I know. That's basically, that's his justification for going ahead and doing the STAR test. Is we're not going to use it for accountability purposes, but we do think it would be good for showing where our students are, and so knowing what we need to do to, you know, get them back to where they need to be.
And I will just mention here that one of ATPE's legislative priorities, we have repeatedly, ever since all this began, urged them to alleviate the burden of standardized testing requirements. And it is one of our 6 legislative priorities to work with the legislature this session. We do have on February 21st, ATPE at the virtual Capitol. We're going to have it's free and open to any ATPE member. It's a virtual event. It'll be an afternoon of panels and information about how to advocate, because as Paul will frequently tell you, he is dealing with the law as it is, which is why some of today has been so incredibly depressing, whereas our GR team is dealing with the law as it could be. And that's an exciting opportunity, I think, for educators to share their stories with lawmakers. So it's a little plug there for another member benefit for you.
And I will say, like Kate said, and I really do understand that a lot of the information that I have provided here is depressing. And that is because that is the state of the law. And like Kate said, I will tell you as a lawyer, lawyers apply the law as it is. Legislators actually create it. And how do you get the legislators to create better laws so that I don't have to be as depressing when it is that I'm explaining what the law is you get involved with the legislators. And like Kate said, we have something coming up that will give you the tools to know how to comfortably do that. So, and I want to tell you personally, please take the time and effort to do that, because I will tell you as a lawyer, I don't like giving depressing news to educators. I've been working with teachers for 24 years now, and you are a great group of people. And I like making your lives better rather than telling you that I'm sorry, there isn't much we can do here. And so basically that comes to you and people like you, letting your legislators know what it is that you need. You know, they hear from a lot of different groups, and you know, they are people, and who they hear from the most are the ones that they are going to take the most seriously. And if they don't hear from teachers, they're going to think, okay, teachers are fine with whatever it is that's going on. So please do get involved, and please use this opportunity as a springboard for getting involved so that we can make this better for everyone.
And I'll just say too, I mean, obviously ATPE is at the Capitol. That's one of the reasons you're members, is to have us advocate for you. But it is also true that if you know someone in a personal situation, and if you can form a relationship with your legislator in your hometown, that's going to stick in their memory bank a lot, because then it's Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so from their child's school that's having the experience, not necessarily just the abstract teachers in the abstract or educators in the abstract. So one thing I think, I have seen a couple news stories this week about the Chicago public schools voting for work stoppages, striking, that sort of thing, because they do not like the direction that their district is going with COVID protocols. When we talk about teachers and educators standing up for themselves, is striking even an option for teachers in Texas?
Not really. And honestly, it's absolutely not a safe option. This is something, and this is something that actually had come up kind of earlier in the school year
Mhm.
as a possibility. There was a lot of social media talk in Texas about, God, maybe we should just go on strike, as school districts were talking about going back to instruction for the 2021 school year. It is particularly dangerous in Texas. And one thing I want to make clear is that the prohibition in Texas, everybody knows what a strike is. It's you're standing on the sidewalk with a sign, and waving at cars that go by. And no, well, when you're supposed to be working. In Texas, the law prohibits governmental workers from what's called engaging in an organized work stoppage is the term that's used in the law. And a term is very general, and it goes beyond just standing on the sidewalk with a sign. Basically, working in concert with any other people to say, I'm not going to go to work because of some issue is an organized work stoppage. In other words, you are engaging in illegal activity. A sick out is an organized work stoppage. Again, if you are purposely saying that I am not going to go to work because of this issue, it is illegal. Now, the reason it is so dangerous in Texas is that, number one, it's illegal. Obviously, as doing something illegal, that puts your job at extreme jeopardy. It puts your educator's license, your teaching certificate, at extreme jeopardy. More than that, though, what the law says, it uses a very general term. It says that if you do that, you can lose all of the benefits that you receive as or because of your public service. In other words, because of your being a teacher. Now, it's very general language. That language doesn't say anything about TRS or retirement, teachers' retirement. We've always been concerned, though, that teacher retirement is certainly something that a teacher receives because of the service that they have provided. It clearly fits the category that the law has. So we've always felt like a teacher who engaged in an organized work stoppage was very much putting their TRS benefits at risk because, again, it would fit the law. The law doesn't say anything specific about TRS. I want to make clear about that. But it does fit what the law does say about teacher benefits. So we do think it is a serious risk. Probably wouldn't lose what you put in, but may very well lose what it is that the state put in. So again, it's not something to go into anywhere lightly. And it's honestly more effective to, like Kate said, get to know your local legislator. I will say, from someone who deals with our lobbyists and works with our lobbyists on bills, we see all the time bills that have been filed because an individual person went to a legislator with an individual situation that they wanted to get fixed. And that has resulted in that legislator actually filing a bill to fix that. Not because there was some huge group of people saying it needed to be done, but because some individual constituent went to them and said they needed something done. We see that all the time. So this is something where your individual voice really can matter.
Okay, well, I think that's really important for everybody to know just because I think it gets confusing. I think there's a lot of news stories. There's certainly a lot on social media these days. Some things that, especially there's a lot of Facebook groups where there's people giving information that may or may not be vetted. So I just think that's good to kind of get that clear what the Texas law is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we are not even through the questions that were submitted ahead of time, and we do have many more great questions that were submitted, and we are right at 6 o'clock. So I think what we'll do, Paul and I will take a look at them and decide. We may produce another video, we may put additional information on the FAQs page, but I think this is, we just both are so in awe of all that you are doing in the classroom and on campuses and dealing with students, no matter what position you're in. I'm going to go ahead and put up a couple of links here for you. As I mentioned, we do have our resources at atpe.org/coronavirus. And then also, as we've talked about, ATP at the virtual Capitol, you can register there. The link is right. There's a link on the homepage. It is completely free for members. It is going to be really fascinating. And I just think a great experience as far as kind of getting that first side, because certainly the legislature will deal a lot with COVID this session. So Paul, I don't know if you have any final thoughts before we sign off for the evening.
And I just wanted to say personally as well, and on behalf of everyone in the Member Legal Services Department too, we really do appreciate all that you've done. Every time I have a chance to talk to a group of teachers, I share that, I have been doing this a long time, a little over 24 years now. Don't know what I did to deserve that or to deserve the honor of being able to do that, but have appreciated that. You all are the greatest group of people who are out there. And without you, as I always tell, I talk to a lot of college students and thank them for going into the profession that you all are in. And just want to let you know, there is a lot of people out there who do recognize what it is that you're doing and recognize how important it is. Without you, there is not anything else. There are no other professions. There is no society. So thank you for everything you do every year, but I can't even imagine, even talking to you all through all that you've gone through this year, dealing with what you have, you deserve more credit than the rest of us would ever be able to give you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us this evening. We will make a version of this available on demand to send out. And then if you have any colleagues, ATP member colleagues that you would like to watch it, that will be available as well. Have a very good evening, and I hope you have a good Friday and a restful weekend. Have a good night.
Thank you.